Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the latest edition of the Woke Bros. Of course, I'm your co-host, Big Waz, aka Wazzy Lambre, and I'm joined by my brother, my partner, no longer in LA. He's back working for the man at UW. Danny Bessner, what's going on, brother?
Hey, Waz, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be back. Hey,
Yes.
I was noticing something today. I was thinking about it. I think I've been on Woke Bros 9 or 10 times. I haven't yet been on the NBA pod. Well, why not?
Well, I'm not the guest booker on group chat and
Oh,
weekends with
blame me
Waz.
for booking. Okay.
Yeah. Weekends with Waz is no more. But you know what? Next time I have guest booking authority, I will come get you for your Charles Oakley takes.
Dude, we can talk about the 94 Knicks. I could talk about them for at least 5 or 6 minutes.
I love it. Hey, listen, man. I wish that I had you on under better circumstances, but obviously, this past weekend, the freaking violence erupted in Palestine and Israel. Of course, as we speak, the Israeli army is bombing the living daylights out of Gaza. Of course, on Saturday, Hamas, whatever y'all want to call them, terrorists, resistance, liberation front, whatever. I mean, like, the distinction sort of doesn't matter for the purposes of what this conflict is about. They swarmed into Israel by land, by sea, by air on hand glides.
Yeah, that
which
was
is the craziest.
Yeah.
The craziest part to me.
Yeah,
And yeah, they killed hundreds of people. They took a bunch of hostages. Obviously, this elicited a very strong response from an Israeli regime that's used to sort of fucking these people up anyway.
Yeah,
and
we could
so
talk about specifically like the sort of situation.
we'll get into that because I wanted today to act as sort of a primer, right? On Israel and Palestine, because I watch a lot of news events. I read a lot of the accounts coming out of the mainstream media. Of course, there's people on Twitter fighting back and forth, but I feel like they just throw around these terms and talk about the conditions on the ground as if everybody who is consuming the news knows exactly what they mean, exactly what those conditions mean. And so obviously Danny, being the PhD scholar that he is on history, specifically with this conflict, Danny being somebody who obviously is Jewish American himself, but also
What gave it away?
We're not getting canceled this episode, Danny. But also, like, you're somebody who went to Jewish primary school, right?
Yeah.
You're somebody who have you done the birthright trip
I didn't
Israel?
do birthright, but I went on a different type of
trip, similar trip to Israel.
Twice. I haven't been in 20 years, over 20 years, but I have.
So you're very familiar with the orthodoxy, the sort of Zionism doctrine, if you will, if there were such a thing. Like, you're very familiar
it's a nationalist ideology. There are different strands of it, but yeah, it's certainly a nationalist ideology. There's a labor Zionist strand, which isn't very powerful. There's a religious Zionist strand. There's a more ethno-national Zionist strand. So just like there are different versions of Americanism, the American ideology, there are different versions of Zionism. And just from a technical stance, it's absolutely true. And it's an ideology.
So as it stands right now, what's your understanding of what's happening on the ground?
So should I give like a little bit of a larger context?
Yeah, go ahead. Do you?
Yeah. So basically, Israel has occupied this place on its west, basically in its west half. Like if you look at Israel on a map, there's a small part in its western border, really southwestern border slightly, called the Gaza Strip. And Israel has been basically in control of the Gaza Strip since the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And over the decades, the situation in Gaza, for a variety of reasons, has gotten worse and worse and worse. It's oftentimes referred to as the world's largest open-air prison. So that might give a sense of the conditions. So just basically the most important sort of political faction or group is Hamas. And as Waz said, Hamas recently, last week, broke out of Gaza and did exactly what was said. This is a big deal in Israel, just to give some very specific political context. One of the Netanyahu's government, and Bibi Netanyahu is, of course, the prime minister of Israel, and he was ruling the government. One of his main things was to actually de-emphasize the importance of Gaza and emphasize instead the importance of the West Bank, which is on Israel's east border, and which is a larger, much more developed, more stable territory than Gaza. So Netanyahu focused more on settlements in Gaza, settlements in the West Bank, annexations in the West Bank, to the detriment of Gaza. So one of the things that seems to have happened is that the Netanyahu administration's focus on the West Bank created an opportunity for Hamas to break out of Gaza and do what the group did, murder civilians and take military targets as well in last Saturday, like was said. So just one more quick thing. After the attacks, the question was how Israel would respond. So domestically, if you can imagine, Netanyahu is quite weak. For people who might not know, there has been a lot of opposition against him in recent months from the more liberal part of the Israeli populace, because his administration was facilitating or allowing what some have referred to as a judicial coup. So there were a lot of protests against Netanyahu, and this further breakout of Gaza really weakens him. So domestically, Netanyahu is feeling weak. There's a rally around the flag phenomenon that is just like in the U.S. after 9/11. Israelis are, feeling securitized and afraid for understandable reasons. And so you have a weak domestic government or a worried domestic government. Netanyahu is also facing corruption charges and all these other things. Meanwhile, internationally, after the attack, basically every major country in the world, or certainly every major country that matters in this context, made clear that Israel could kind of do what it wants. So you have a international environment that's permissive to what Israel might want to do, which is probably not going to last forever. It's a short moment. And then you have a domestically weak Benjamin Netanyahu, someone who's afraid, who really his strategy.
So he has to project some level of strength by killing as many Palestinians as possible.
This is the worry, right? That international permissiveness plus domestic weakness would engender a particularly strong response, which it seems like it might happen. There have been airstrikes now for days, and you can see images of those online, and it also appears like there might be a ground invasion and boots on the ground occupation, which could be a very serious escalation.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, I'm going to be annoying this episode, Danny. I'm going to be that person at the party who finds out what it is that you do for a living and start peppering you with these not even fast out, but these sort of simplistic questions. So as best as you can say, what's the fight about?
Well, the fight is about access. We're Marxists here. It's about access to land and material resources. And not to go into the whole history, but groups that were at one point maybe not totally, but like maybe more equally situated in the 1930s and 1940s in an ethno-national conflict over land. One side, the Israelis, has decidedly won. And the other side, the Palestinians, I would say, has really lost, at least until this point, and have suffered under decades of occupation. So it's really about the character of a nation state, fundamentally. What type of state will Israel be? And Israel is a state organized around ethno-nationalist ideas. They have laws that are explicitly linked to, the only way to really put it is race/religion/ethnicity, in that there's something called the right of return. And if you meet certain rubrics of descent, you could return to Israel and become a full citizen.
You could go to Israel if you wanted to, Danny.
I could go to Israel and become a citizen, even though my understanding is that Israel has prevented some Jews in the past from becoming citizens. Famously, Meyer Lansky, I believe, was not.
He was seeking asylum in Israel, and they told him to kick rocks.
Yeah, I think he was one of the only people denied citizenship in Israel. And I also believe in more recently there have been critics that have been denied. But anyway, whatever. There are rules organized around that. Whereas if you were a Palestinian and kicked out in 1948 or who fled in 1948, you would not have access to your family's land. Now, Jews would sometimes reply, well, I don't have access to my family's land in Germany, and that's the edge of history, but these are what the fight's ultimately about, and a formation of a nation state and what that nation state means.
So, and because I think that point about this like ethno nation state based on religion, ethnicity, race, whatever you want to call it, is important, because some people might say, and again, these are things that you might hear at a party. They might be like, look, the US did the same shit to the fucking Native Americans. We pummeled them, but we didn't we didn't pulverize them into the US equivalent of the Gaza Strip. We just, we've completely cooked them, and we just let them be US citizens. They did, like, we gave them some casinos,
Well, we really did eradicate. I mean, in a real way, like,
yes,
there were
which is the difference,
right? And so I think what you'll often hear is like, well, every country does this, right? Mm-hmm. Every country that's based on settlement and colonization, like the United States was, like Brazil was, like
Australia was,
Mexico. I mean, like, actually there's a unique history, but there are settlement colonies that do participate in indigenous genocide and eradication. And people will say, why are people criticizing Israel when these other countries have, they would say, even worse pests? And what I would give to that is that, you shouldn't let the problems and crimes of the past prevent from those that are undergoing that are happening in your own time, that moral norms have changed, and that I mean, I'm an American. The United States implicitly supports the policy by really providing Israel with a lot of...
Well, no, but what I'm trying to say, Danny, is why can't, in some sort of peace accord, right? Just imaginary, just humor me here. Why can't we just sort of bring the Palestinians into the Jewish state?
It might have been possible. Two reasons. It might have been possible 30 years ago, but I think conditions have changed, and Israel's become so much more powerful, relatively speaking, that they don't need to make those sorts of agreements. Two, there's a fear that Israel's character as a Jewish state won't be preserved if there's a lot of...
And that's what I was kind of getting at. It's like, idea, if we do form a nationhood in this place,
it is a Jewish state, that is
exactly, and we bring all these Arabs into the nation, then the entire point of Zionism, which is a state that is Jewish, that becomes moot. Like, what's the point?
Which emerges, and I think this is really crucial in order to understand the Israeli perspective, which emerges from the traumas of European anti-Semitism that culminate in the Holocaust. I mean, the Holocaust is still in living memory, so there are a lot of people who believe that, and one hears this growing up as a Jew, that there's a safe haven, that you can't know that there won't be another Holocaust. And I think it's important to understand, like, the sheer trauma of the Holocaust to the last 3 or so generations of Jews. I think the number is 1 in 3 Jews were killed, like, on the world stage. I hope I get these numbers right. I used to know exact 2/3 of European Jewry. Like, the European Jewish population was eradicated, and Israel's response, and Israelis, many would admit this, to that sort of genocide, right? So this is sort of the mindset, this post-traumatic mindset of a state formed within living memory of a genuinely eradicationist project, with many people have direct family connections to people murdered, and that even I do, and so it's just like a very common thing. And so I think this is what's undergirding a lot of the Israeli policy and American support for it in particular. Now, to me, I would say that, we have to that sort of emotional reaction to a genuine trauma shouldn't necessarily guide policy now and forever, and that there are other considerations to be had when discussing this.
So, because I listen to your show a lot, Danny, shouts to the fellow Prestige heads. Go make sure you subscribe and become a Patreon of American Prestige.
Substack.
Oh, excuse me, Substack. Sorry, Substack. I get my subscription
Yeah, you get
services.
your independent. Now that you're big time, you don't care anymore.
Well, I mean,
We're gonna have to worry about that.
well, we'll see. I feel like that's a animating part of the sort of posture that Israel's state takes, right? It's like, no, we can't have some half Arab state when, in the past, it's been state policies in places like Germany to eradicate us, in places like Russia to completely subjugate and fucking oppress us, in places like the United States to not accept people trying to flee the fucking Holocaust. That's part of this story.
And
Is
it's like
that
close enough that it still has emotional resonance. In 100
right?
years, it probably won't be, but like
Mm,
people my grandparents' age were in Auschwitz. It's still
right.
generationally kind of close. Like my child, like he will feel less close, and my grandchildren, it'll be more like in memory. So
Gotcha.
to some degree, this is fading as time goes on, but it's still something like Netanyahu, who's what, 70? I mean, it's a
Right.
living memory, I
Yep.
think that undergirds a lot of, not to excuse by any stretch, but I just trying to explain the sort of mindset.
Sure. So I want to get to the sort of Palestinian mindset in all of this. Can you explain to people what it means for Israel to be annexing and settling, quote unquote? I feel like that word is so like,
It's
um,
literally what it sounds like. It's you go in and you take land and you live on land, and that over time that land becomes part of the larger state. Like again, has occurred throughout settler colonial history, from the United States to Australia to again Brazil. Is that it's a policy of colonization. What's strange, or what appears strange about it, and that makes it difficult to understand, is that this is really hundreds of years after the moment when colonization happened, and it's after sort of the decolonizing revolutions of the 1950s and 60s and
right.
70s that occurred in the Middle East and Africa in particular, and East Asia and Asia. So it's an atavism, in a sense that there's still this like in progress colonial project. It's just
Project happening.
great. Yeah, and it's exactly what it sounds like. I mean, Gaza was really shut off. Israel was in total control.
But no, I just want to like, because again, like I feel like people they hear like, oh, there are these settlers, right? You gotta understand, especially like, because Danny, you're so far removed from whatever history you got in high school and elementary school, but the term settler is not a pejorative in our teaching of it to Americans.
Right, right.
It's completely not. It's like this innocuous, like, no, these people, they came and grew like grapes and shit, and just they were herding cattle, and they made these little straw cribs, and it was just great. But like, can you like, who is a modal Israeli settler in the West Bank? What does it look like when you come and you take something? Who are you taking it from, if anybody? How do you keep your shit after doing that? What does that look like?
Right. I mean, it comes in and oftentimes involves displacing populations that were already there, and that could come through intimidation. It could come through the use of the official state. It could just be land that hasn't been exploited to a particular degree. And then you go in and, you have military support oftentimes, and you literally start economically developing the land. And over time, there's more and there's more and there's more. And the idea, I think in Israel, from like a far right government like Netanyahu's, was that Israel would annex much of the territory that it was able to, maybe not all of it, but a significant degree. They would be in relative control of the West Bank. Gaza would be an afterthought, and that would be it. And so
yeah, you hear this a lot in the news. There's this idea that a lot of the military might was deployed to the West Bank in order to secure these settlements, essentially these new developments, in order to make it like to add to the area that is
to
now
annex
Israel.
territory. And I think it's important. I mean, it's hard to get into, but this has to do with like the particular domestic political coalition that supports Netanyahu, which has become more and more right wing and more in hock to the settlement movement, which wasn't always in the history of Israel supported like it has. So again,
but why is it? What what is the justification for it? Why is it important that they settle more of the West Bank?
There's religious justification.
Got you.
There's that this is the land of the Jews, and they should take it back. There's always security justification. The stronger your border is, and there's trauma from war, and there's developmental. Basically the typical justifications for colonization. It's just strange because, again, this happened so much longer ago here. I'm in Seattle right now. That settlement ended
about 500 years ago.
Yeah, it's like a really long time. Yeah. So
okay, so if you're a Palestinian person living in the West Bank, you just constantly see this happening. Essentially, they're coming in, they're bullying the fuck out of people who have lived there for literally centuries. Like this is not like it's not like me and my Haitian immigrant parents just pulled up to Brooklyn and might have bought a crib or whatever. Like, no, these families have lived there for literally centuries. And it's backed by the Israeli regime, and they just kick these people off and it doesn't take a genius or a scientist to understand what's happening. It's like, no, we're slowly but surely pushing you the fuck out of here.
And
so you're all gone.
It's been a real problem for international politics because a lot of the surrounding governments don't want to get involved because Israel has just become so allied with the United States and has become such a de facto part of the larger American imperium that it's very difficult to challenge them, in the way like happened in the 67 and 73. And frankly, the Arab governments don't want to challenge them. There's from my understanding, there's no real like outreach to the Palestinian people in a real way. There's domestic issues related to Palestinian refugees in places like Egypt and Jordan. So it's a population that has to a large degree been abandoned by the world. And it's really a terrible tragedy to witness. It's I mean, there's just nothing to say to give a real sense of sort of the traumas and the degradations experienced by colonized peoples.
Okay, so another thing I wanted to get into, as best as you can describe to folks, what are the facts on the ground in Gaza today? Like, what is the life of a Palestinian person living? What's their daily life like? You hear this stuff about 4 hours of electricity, constant raids and blah blah blah. Like, what does that look like for the average Gazan?
Yeah, I think it's similar to a displaced persons camp. And it's similar to kind of like a prison camp where there's ebbs and flows of violence and fear. The issue, I think, is that something could happen at any time.
Gotcha.
Right? It's like you hear about people in Waziristan where the United States did all of its drone strikes. Like they don't like open skies, right? There's a notion that there's not in control, and you don't understand the logic for things. And it's just people could go to look at Human Rights Watch to get a exact breakdown of how it is, but it's a terrible living conditions, and it's really tragic and sad.
And it's every single day, right? And so
it's every single day. It's like being in a displaced persons camp,
with no hope of anything ever getting better. And you're understanding
very young population, very little hope. I mean, because I think it's difficult to say that the movement didn't lose. Maybe there's something that could happen. You could get something like a Good Friday Agreement, but it doesn't look good. So there's lack of a hope in the future. There's a hopelessness. There's bad living conditions. It's just very tragic and sad.
And who are Hamas? Because I've seen this freaking. These guys have been in the news more than anything that I've ever seen in my life, right? And it's
they're the armed/political grouping of a particular faction of.
Do they have a political constituency, Danny? Are they sort of doing their own thing? Are they supported by the people? Like, I think folks need to understand this.
It's difficult to oops. Sorry, it's difficult. I am not enough of an expert to say to what degree, but
what do they purport themselves to be then?
I mean, these representatives of the Palestinian nationalist movement, and I'm certain that there are elements of the Palestinian population that support them, just like like
anything else.
people.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. You would have to get details on the ground about how people, which I don't have access to or know, how people like, does Hamas participate in like local health organizations? You know,
Mm-hmm.
you look at like the traditional Muslim Brotherhood. One of the reasons that they were able to succeed throughout the Arab world was because they basically functioned as a social service organization. So
Gotcha.
I don't know enough about like the deep. I mean, like, I would venture to say that there's not a lot of support for actions that might be viewed as effectively suicidal, but I don't know.
Yeah, because the sort of way this gets framed from like it's so funny. And this is a silly example, but like I remember when Biden got elected, and like because there's a lot of black professional women within my social orbit, like the amount of Yas queens I saw on social, I was just like, man, like I really do know like a lot of black yuppies who are like really excited about this Kamala Harris thing. Like it's one of those things like you spend no time ever thinking about Kamala Harris or people who would ever give a fuck about her. And then all of a sudden the election happens and it's like, oh shit, like she does have somewhat of a constituency amongst, a sort of quasi elite group of black people.
Everyone
right?
has. Yeah, I mean, everyone, groups oftentimes have some sort of constituency. I mean, I doubt Hamas would have been able to pull off something like this
without much of a constituency.
Yeah, it's an incredible humiliation to the military. Something I should have said also earlier is that it really is a humiliation because Israel prides itself on its security structures and its powerful military, and it's had that reputation. It's been attacked so many times, and it was able to succeed. And there were true, like, brilliant strategic military victories. Like there was a tank battle in the Golan Heights. It's like very famous. And so there's like this pride in militarization, particularly again after the Holocaust, where there's all this like masculine ideals being set out that Jews aren't always going to be slaughtered, blah, blah, blah. So it's a humiliation on a number of levels. So I think that also is going to engender an even harsher response that might have otherwise occurred in a different nation.
So again, I just want to pivot to people so that people can get a better understanding. It's just like the shit that you see, like don't even bother turning on CNN or MSNBC or any of that shit, like much less the New York Times, right? What I would say is that there's this framing of this being Israel's 9/11, right? And all my Jewish people that I follow on Instagram and stuff like that, they're like, man, like we don't decapitate babies and blah 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 blah, and this being in 9/11 and all of that stuff, which I wouldn't even dispute, right? As somebody who like I don't have any skin in the game, like it's not really something that I wake up every single day thinking about.
This is what I would say is that like this. Like as a Jew, it's like images of Jews being slaughtered in living memory of the Holocaust is going to engender a particular emotional response in the population. That's how I read it. It's like this. It's not epigenetic in the sense that it's in the genes, but it's like the Holocaust is very much tied to modern Jewish identity. When I went on a trip, I went to Auschwitz, then Israel. That's a particular.
And that's the message, like that. Yeah, it's not. Right.
Yeah, that's what I think explains comments like that. That's what I think it explains, like the emotional horror, which is, I mean, obviously the death of civilians is horrible in any instance. We would say that about the death of Palestinian civilians is absolutely terrible. The death of Israeli civilians is absolutely terrible. I mean, I think I told you, one of my former students was killed. This guy, Chaim Katzman.
Wow.
And he was a great guy. He was doing peace work on the Gaza border, and he was murdered in the first stage of the Gaza attack. And that's a terrible tragedy, as a progressive leftist humanist. And that's what I think engenders this sort of anger and.
So I think about it 9/11 parallels in a sort of different way. Spencer Ackerman, who you guys have had on your show. I'm a subscriber to his newsletter, Forever Wars, which, by the way, I'll tell anybody, if you want to be kept abreast on foreign affairs, all you need is Spencer and American Prestige. I swear to fucking God.
He's a Brooklyn guy, too.
Wow. Yeah, I know he lived in Brooklyn. I thought he was a Brooklyn hipster, though.
No. I think he like grew up in Flatbush. I think he might have.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No, he's like real. He's like really from Brooklyn.
So he wrote a piece in The Nation about 20 years since 9/11. Essentially, he went and visited the 9/11 museum, and he was like, this shit is such a waste of time and like such a tragedy in the way that we tell this story because it's such hogwash.
Right.
You know, this idea that these crazy Muslim extremists they just dropped from the moon, Danny. They just dropped from the moon, hating America, right?
Yeah,
and this
totally
idea of an unprovoked attack on the U.S. land and this death of innocence, and none of these people deserve this, and blah, 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 blah. And the point that Spencer was ultimately trying to make, he's like, of course, the people in the buildings in the Twin Towers did not provoke an attack. Of course, all of those people who died senselessly. Of course, they were innocent. But to characterize that attack as an attack that was quote unquote unprovoked, that doesn't address the actions of U.S. empire abroad, quote unquote, in our name is crazy.
Yeah. Like this is why I think this is what sort of Marx brings, is that you look at the structures. You don't look at like the moral play of the individual actors. Like for 9/11, you could see how empire and colonization and capitalism led to a particular concatenation of factors that led the child of a Saudi dynasty to become one of the largest, funders of Islamic jihad throughout the world, right? There's a context that engenders these things. Just like in the Palestinian-Israel conflict, the context of settler colonialism, the context of being part of the American empire shapes everything that happens. It's just that's not the way, it's almost not the way like liberalism functions, not to get too abstract. Like,
no, but please do.
Like liberals and liberalism focuses on like individual acts, right? It centers the individual. If you're more of a left winger, you really center the structure that it creates a series of incentives.
Danny, just think about it. Just think about the crazy shit these guys did, these Hamas homies did, knowing full well what was going to come behind it.
That's what's so strange about it. That's what I asked Rashid Khalidi. I don't see the strategic goal, but maybe they're just so desperate that it was like it was just like a fuck you, that even if they knew that it was going to get, it's basically a suicidal act. And that's why I imagine I don't know how like Hamas is going to fare after this, because it's like such a provocation that the outcome is so predictable.
Yeah, and so again, like people are going to be like, oh, you're blaming Israel for what happened. I'm like, bruh, like, good, look. No sane person can say that the people who died this past weekend and the days after are people who provoked Hamas. That's absurd. Of course, they themselves did not provoke this attack. That everybody knows that. But again,
punishment is against international law as well, right? Collective punishment is something that all people should respect for anyone, that you're punishing a population for the actions of a group or a series of individuals. It is against international law, and it's terrible morally. You shouldn't do that ever. You could be against that in any population in the world. You should be against collective punishment, which is, one of the questions
Israel is doing right now.
Yeah, and about firebombing and airstrikes in general. I mean, it makes you think of the atomic bomb. It makes you think of, the burning of Tokyo and the destruction of Germany. Like this gets into the problem of air war itself, which is by definition a form of collective warfare, a collective punishment. And I wish we could even talk about whether anything like that should ever be
used. Airstrike should ever be used.
Is collective punishment. And just one thing I want to make sure, if you ever hear that it's like really targeted and really well, that's just not true. Nothing is ever precise like that.
Yeah. And that's what I would say, because a lot of this stuff is about decapitation of babies. Of course, this is heinous. If this actually happened, that's
absolutely inhuman.
This isn't even nobody would argue that shit was okay. But what I would posit to those people, I'm like, would you have rather that Hamas had U.S. airplanes to bomb Israeli babies with? Is that somehow a more honorable death for those babies? Is it more just when it's done that way?
I think it gets into, you could just see that we talk about this conflict like it's two equal states. And it's just basically one extremely powerful state and a society of people that are incredibly disorganized. And you could see it with the destruction of Gaza going out right now with very sophisticated, if not, accurate weaponry. The issue, I think, is even if Israel followed every international law and every guideline to a T, this type of warfare is going to kill innocents. And we should just be against that in principle.
100%. And I want to get to you about some, talking points that people might encounter while they're trying to follow this news story, right? I think obviously there's just going to be a much, bigger fervor to try to understand what's happening over there. Just now, I'm sitting next to my lady and she's watching a video on social and some fucking British guy is like, essentially, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. Like they were never the sovereign of this land. They never had control of this land. There's no such thing. There never was a Palestine. What would you say to something like that, Danny?
All nationalisms are constructed. I mean, I would really point people. We made this long series on the history of Palestine with Rashid Khalidi.
Please go listen to this.
Go listen to it, because I mean, all nationalisms and identities are constructed. So it's such a silly thing to even say. There's no like real Americanness. There's no real anything. These are all constructed over time in historical context. And the Palestinian national identity is as legitimate as any other form of national identity, is what I would say. And to claim otherwise is very strange, ahistorical, and theoretical. I mean, for us, the goal should be to get past all nationalisms, but we could still recognize, if we're still living in the world.
Man, it's tough, Danny. I think about that all the time.
Yeah, that's the goal, though, right? Like, and we shouldn't forget that.
It should be, but nationalism is such an animating force in the sense that, like, it gets people to row in the same direction. It's so fucking powerful.
Destroy the left, dude. Like, the fucking nationalism is why the countries fought each other in World War I, why the working classes fought each other and didn't unite. Nationalism is the most powerful ideology of the last 500 years. It's not even close.
It's not even close.
Not even close.
And so I want to get you out of here. I don't want to take too much of your time, Danny. There's no way to solve this. The Palestinians are pretty they're not going to leave. They're not going to move. Yeah. The only way to end this literally would be to kill them, would be to
or make
Holocaust
them citizens of Israel, right? That's
it seems like the only two options,
right? Because I think what the Israeli government had hoped was that they could kind of just not address it, that there would be a rump Palestinian group in Gaza and an increasingly rump one in the West Bank, and they would kind of just always be there, kind of like how racism always kind of exists in the United States. Right. They would kind of just always be there. And the shock of one of the reasons that this was just such a big shock is that it showed that you can't demonstrate, that you can't just ignore it. So it's going to force a reckoning for Israel, for the United States that supports Israel. Is that what are you going to do in this situation? And I would urge people in the United States listening to this, they have any interest, to tell their political representatives that one shouldn't support collective punishment of a people ever.
Man, there's really nothing much else to say. Danny, thank you so much for your time today, man. This brother is a scholar. It's like literally a historian.
A doctor.
A doctor. I've never called you Dr. Danny Bessner before. I need to start calling you Doc.
Yeah, when I reply to like wedding invites, I always write doctor. And when I book planes, that's the only time I ever use it.
I love it, man. American Prestige, obviously, easily one of my favorite podcasts. Again, I cannot implore you guys enough. Go listen to your Danny's discussion, or it's a discussion series on the history of Palestine. It is excellent. It's essential to understanding the conflict. It's essential to understanding that ultimately, again, it's just another capitalistic, colonialistic project on these people.
Nationalism. I think this one really underlines nationalism.
Nationalism.
It's I feel like there was a lot of it after 9/11, but America, it goes in and out, right? We're in a moment where it's not in.
We don't really give a fuck about American nationalism right now.
Right
we
now,
just don't.
Dude, remember fucking freedom fries?
Oh my God, it was nuts.
9/11? It was crazy. People would get I remember I was reading, people would get attacked for not wearing the American flag pin. So it's not like that. But I think this highlights, the many problems of nationalism in the world.
All right, we will see you guys next week. Peace out.